Here is Sailor Studio 730, a red ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
At first, I felt like I was going to be getting a much lighter tone, and I was wrong. This is a perfect classic red ink. It's very consistent and a solid performer that has no tone variation by pen or paper and no shading at all. It performs just as well on a non-fountain pen friendly paper and almost as well on copy paper. If the greatest classic ink is what they were really going for here, then I think they got it. It's red like the classic Superman cape. It's super. Thanks for asking. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with a fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
The pen for today is a Sailor Rhodia.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, we get a great classic red that has no feathering, has no spread, has no shading, has a great look on the page. Normally not a color I go for, but I'm really enjoying the way this really looks. Looking at the medium nib, it looks exactly like the extra fine. It has no feathering, it has no spread, it has no shading. This is going to be a boring review, so just stand by. Looking at the stub nib, it is exactly like the extra fine and the medium, with the exception of the line variation that come from a stub. It has no feathering, it has no spread, it's the same tone as the others. It has no shading. It's beautiful. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade, it doesn't give much to talk about except how nice it looks. Looking at the medium nib, it is the exact same tone as the extra fine, the exact same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread, it does not shade. It just still looks good. Told you it's going to be boring. Looking at the stub nib, it's the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread, it does not shade. Looking at the back of the page, a little bit of a surprise is it got very deep into this paper. I don't think you could take your notes on the back of this page. I'll live with it for the way it did on the front, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade. It is obviously a very opaque ink as it is unaffected by the tone of the paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade. It is still a lively red on the page. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does not shade. It's just funny because I need to say it each time. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that there would be no problem continuing your notes back here as it doesn't bleed or ghost.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade. It's just fantastic. It stands out from the quad rule with no problem. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It still doesn't feather, still doesn't spread, still doesn't shade, still stands out from the quad rule. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does not shade, stands out from the quad rule, really showing why their inks are so good. Looking at the back of the page, there's no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Ackerman Dutch Masters, their number 7. Here is Diamine Brilliant Red. Here is Organic Studios Oscars Copper. Here is Robert Oster Astrakiza Rot.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Very nice, considering this paper has a tendency to kind of dull out and ink some, and it didn't. Also, it didn't feather, didn't spread, didn't shade. Great right here for students. This is an awesome second ink in a student notebook. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does not shade. It does stand out from the quad rule and look amazing on the page. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade. It does stand out from the quad rule from the Clairfontaine. Man, I thought I was going to get this all as a one take. I'm leaving it in because there's not much to say, and you get to see some of this beautiful ink writing. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that there is no bleeding and no ghosting. Great for students to continue their notes back here.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Platinum Blue Black. Here is Bookbinder's Ground Rattler Snake. Here is KWZ Iron Gall Blue number 1. Here is Private Reserve Velvet Black.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. There's almost nothing for feather. There's the slightest bit of spread. It's really doing fantastic. 100% usable and great on this paper. It doesn't shade. It's really just amazing. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. There's a tiny bit of feathering, almost imperceptible. I doubt it comes through on camera. I can only spot a couple of tiny spots that it has it, like have long on the first line or the F of before on the second, but almost nothing else. Does it shade? No. Does it perform exceptionally well on this paper? Yes. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does feather tiny. You see it his on the second line, or the H in head on the second line. Does it spread? Yes, just tiny bits. Both of them are totally ignorable for how well this ink is doing. It's not shading, but it is being a top-notch performer. Looking at the back of the page, you can see how deep this ink does get into the paper. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath. However, there's no continuing your notes back here, but that's copy paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
In every pen I used, it was the same tone and no shading. So obviously it doesn't matter what pen you put this in, it's a dealer's choice. So go enjoy grading those papers with every pen you own.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.